Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, folks, everyone who is going to watch this or will be watching this. Welcome to our session today on podcasting, tech, teach, talk. We wanted to play homage to TTT as a teaching approach as well, and we wanted to focus more on how we can leverage podcasting as the ultimate task type. And before we just jump right in, I wanted to thank the Task-Based Language Teaching Conference organization in Groningen for making this possible. We wanted to be there in person, but unfortunately we couldn't make it. But once again, thank you for accommodating us, for making this happen. And we're very happy that we're also going to be recording this and releasing it as an episode of our podcast. Before we jump right in, Andrew is just going to do a very quick introduction of who we are and what we do before we jump right into our agenda for today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you again for having us. Really nice to be here. I'm Andrew and this is Leo, and we are teachers. We're from Canada. We're zooming in, I guess, from Toronto this morning, our morning, your afternoon. And we also run Learn Your English, which is our company, and mostly our podcast, Teacher Talking Time, is where we started this. Leo, what was the year? End of 2018, I think. We're in year 7 of our
Year
podcast.
7, 2018 into 2019.
So we do a couple of different things through the podcast and through our company, but mainly what we're here to talk about today is how we try to bridge the gap between classroom practice and applied research. And this diagram on the screen hopefully represents this. I think it's fair to say, Leo, when we began our podcast, it was more of a one-way. I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, and this is fresh in my mind. A one-way view of we wanted ourselves and people like us, teachers, practicing teachers, to be more informed or have more access to disseminate research and apply it in our classrooms. But what we discovered, I think, through doing this is that it was actually a two-way street, that a lot of researchers also wanted an opportunity to talk about their research in a different format that's maybe not with different people and different stakeholders from the norm. So the podcast has turned into this bridge, two-way bridge of researchers talking to, of course, other researchers and teachers getting access to researchers and the research that's going on, and allowing the teacher to choose for their own context what can apply, what's appropriate for them, and to feel confident that what they're doing in their classrooms is at least somewhat informed by what's happening in the research world. And if you're not familiar with us or haven't listened to our show, that's okay. Here it is. It's called Teacher Talking Time. And we release, Leo was joking earlier that we have lots of time today, 2.5 hours, but nobody has ever accused us of being short winded. So our podcasts are quite long. But of course, when you invite amazing people like Audrey, who came on, you don't want to give them only 20 minutes. You want to give them lots of time to talk about their amazing ideas. So episodes are usually about an hour and a half sometimes, and they're once for that reason they're once a month, and we release one every month. One for April came out, I guess, a couple of days ago, Leo, with Jennifer Jenkins. We had John Levis before that from Iowa State, and many Audrey episode was, I think, in November, Audrey, if I'm not mistaken, of last year. So you can get it in Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. We also put the video versions on our YouTube channel as well. And maybe you've seen some of these folks walking around the conference. I'm not sure who everyone.
That's for Jane, and she says hello.
Okay, fantastic. This image is a very humbling image for us. Again, year 7 of our show. Full circle for us talking here today. I think I can speak for Leo and say when we attended this conference in 2019, when it was here in Canada, when it was in Ottawa, that was at the very beginning of our show. We had a few episodes, but we hadn't really started yet. And we met a lot of really amazing people. And that conference, I think, is fair to say, was an impetus for us, a change moment in a very positive way. And a lot of people that we've met at that conference have come on the show and have contributed and collaborated with us. One specifically with Ava Kachava that we'll talk about later, but Laura Brafonsky from Georgetown, Mariah, of course, Pilar, Audrey is there, Paula Winky from Michigan State. A lot of these people are seminal, and we're very thankful to them. And we met them at that first conference, and maybe they're walking around there. So it's been quite lovely and really awesome experience over the last few years. And today, let's get into it. It's 5 checkpoints that we'll get through in today's session. What is podcasting? First of all, we'll start there. And then Leo will walk us through the evidence on the benefits of podcasting for learners and podcasting as a task type as well. I'll share some case studies that we've done in those years using podcasting with learners, 3 different case studies that we can share with you on the benefits. And then we'll just say number 5 is a surprise. Audrey knows, but we won't say anything for now. Number 5 will be a surprise about halfway through the session. And maybe Leo, can you walk us through the aims of the session today?
Yeah, we have very realistic aims, I would say. And I think first and foremost, we just really want to explicate the role that podcasting has as a technology mediated task and how it, in a way, aligns with some of the most important core principles in TBLT. We're going to also look into analyzing the pedagogical and motivational benefits of podcasting. And we're going to look at this from a language learner perspective. And when Andrew talks about some of the case studies, I think we will have an opportunity to evaluate the impact of these podcasting projects have on different aspects of learning, such as engagement, autonomy, and proficiency. And of course, hopefully at the end, we'll have a chance to evaluate the potential of podcasting both as a teaching tool as well as a research instrument in second or additional languages. Andrew's just going to walk us through what podcasting really is. He's got some very interesting facts about the topic.
As I say to my students, let's find out if they're interesting. Let's find out if everyone thinks that they're interesting. But yeah, what is podcasting? A very simple question, I think, right? It's not a bad screenshot of us doing it, but this is an episode with Sarah Mercer. If you're not familiar with her work, I highly suggest running to watch that one. She talks about teacher burnout, and it's wonderful, or teacher well-being, more specifically. What is podcasting? Through my research on this, and this is fascinating how fast technology changes because, I don't know, 2004 doesn't seem like that long ago, although I suppose it was. But before that, the word podcast did not exist. So it was coined by British technology journalist Ben Hammersley in 2004. Apparently, the first quote unquote podcast was released in 2003, but it was not called a podcast because the word did not exist. A couple of people released a recorded radio version through an RSS feed in 2003, which is documented as the first quote unquote podcast, but they didn't call it that because the word didn't exist. Ben Hammersley coined it in 2004, and it actually was the word of the year in 2004 that year. And then as we move forward here, Fernando Aguilar, who also we interviewed on our show, did research on this, and he defines it as a blend of the words iPod and broadcast, which makes sense if you think about it, but also is another window into how fast technology changes, because I don't even think they don't make iPods anymore, for sure. And if you have one, good for you. Good for you. But I think this is where it comes from. At that time, obviously, there were no smartphones, I'm pretty sure. Maybe a BlackBerry, but I don't think BlackBerry was downloadable. So it was a portable show, which obviously now is much easier to walk around and listen to podcasts. And when we interviewed Fernando on the show, this stuck out to us because Leo, you remember this, right at the beginning of the pandemic, before we started recording today, we're chatting with the audience about doing something like this remotely, enhanced by the pandemic, or just the survival instincts technologically of the pandemic. And we ran sessions at the beginning of COVID called Pedagogy Before Technology, meaning still we can have good pedagogy, good methods online as opposed to in person. And Fernando really talked about this, where he said, just because someone knows how to use technology doesn't mean they know how to use it for learning, which really stuck out to us. And that's really what we're here to talk about today is podcasting now, and podcasts are everywhere and very common, but how do we use them for learning? How can we leverage them, not just as a tool to say, hey, go listen to this, but an actual informed approach to learning an additional language? And a little bit of preliminary research that we not conducted, but just asked our audience through LinkedIn and other venues prior in preparation for today's talk, just to see how familiar teachers are, at least in our network, with this. And so I just asked, have you used podcasting with your students in the past? Very simple. And you can see a close split that I was surprised by. 48% said yes, and that it worked very well. And 39% said no, and they hadn't even considered it. So seems to be an opportunity here to apply this with many teachers in their classrooms. Just a couple of stories that I want to highlight before we get into the research on it. Dr. Jennifer McDonald, who Leo and I have both worked with in the past. She's formerly, I think, she doesn't work
She
at
used to
Dalhousie.
be at Dalhousie, but she's not there anymore. She's working in China now.
Okay, in Halifax, in Canada. She shared a story of creating a clue-based podcasting course for high school students in 2010, so pretty close to the impetus of that coining of the term. And as she describes here, that it was awesome. They used Audacity, which is like the OG audio editing. It's still open source. It's completely free. It's a great one to use if you are using a PC. And fake ads, comedy, fiction, and it sounds like she really exploited it to the fullest. And it was the subject of her very first conference talk ever in 2010, which I thought was interesting as we're presenting here for the first time on this. So that was a cool story, I thought. Martin Cook also shared a cool story of having students create a podcast in a listening and speaking class prior to the pandemic, but they were able, as Leo will illuminate later today, able to create their own tasks, own authentic listening materials. They were able to scaffold it, the technical terms of podcasting, but also respond to other students in the class and listen to their podcast and do some reflection and responses that way. Really cool ways that teachers are already using podcasting in their classes. And a client of ours, Vicky, kind of describing how she uses them not necessarily for productive skills, but for input and for extensive listening, expanding on the classes and giving them something to task to do through listening after classes to consolidate what they've learned. And she works with sales and marketing professionals, so giving them podcasts on to learn techniques for that. So a couple of teacher stories there on how people are already using podcasts, which is great to see. But that 39% of teachers who haven't considered it, that's maybe where we want to focus today and maybe give some ideas to people if they're curious about the benefits of podcasting. So I'll hand it over to Leo as he walks us through those.
Yeah, as Andrew just mentioned, these teachers that just basically share some of their experiences using podcasting speak very highly to the benefits of podcasting in language education. As a matter of fact, the thesis of my master's was on the benefits of podcasting as a professional development tool or continuous professional development tools for teachers. So I was looking at it from the language teacher perspective. And of course, I'm not going to talk much about the benefits of podcasting as a learning tool for teachers, but they basically fall under the social constructivist theory. There's also this emphasis, according to Cooper, on the construction of knowledge that is done primarily through active exploration, observation, and of course, interpretation. Rosel Aguilar and Maya and de Freitas also mentioned that because people are producing knowledge through vocalizing it, this knowledge becomes more internalized and allow for much better reflections and what they describe as self-paced learning. But let's move on to talk about the 5 benefits. The next one, the 5 benefits of, next one, Andrew, the next slide. Yes, the 5 benefits that we have here for podcasting from a language learner perspective. And as you can see, we have enhanced listening and comprehension skills, the development of critical thinking as well as reflection, the boost of creativity and digital literacy, increased student autonomy and engagement. And those of us who are strong proponents of task-based language teaching, it's the idea of active learning versus the passive consumption of knowledge about the language. So I'm going to go through each one of these very briefly. We're going to share our references at the end through a QR code because we just have way too many. So there was just not enough room in the slides and we wanted to keep the visuals nice and attractive. So speaking in terms of the benefits for listening and comprehension skills, quite a lot of studies show that integrating podcasts in English classrooms or EFL or ESL classrooms, they definitely have shown an improvement in terms of listening comprehension and speaking skills. I've seen a couple of studies that actually where students were listening to podcasts, especially with the idea of note taking, a lot of them have reported that they perceived it as a very useful tool for improving their comprehension. In addition to that, some of the research also suggests that listening to podcasts really provides the kind of exposure to the authentic spoken language, which again also leads to training students in more attentive listening and also real world processing of language. A couple of other studies that we found also suggest that listening to podcasts definitely leads to better pronunciation. And one interesting study that I found was that a lot of students found that their confidence in speaking because of this repeated audio engagement, really improved. And of course, we had an interview with Sheila Thorne, who does a lot of research on listening in second language. She also spoke about this, but one of them is that it moves beyond what we call the scripted textbook exercises, where students are just listening and filling in gaps, to what we would describe as a more meaningful and engaging listening experience. So, overall, yes, there is definitely a lot of evidence to support the fact that listening extensively or listening to podcasts will definitely or may definitely lead to an improvement in those two specific areas, which leads us to the second benefit, which is the development of critical thinking and reflection. And what the research suggests is that even the fact that you are creating a podcast, or the creation of a podcast, requires certain levels of critical thinking, because you have to conduct research, you have to evaluate the content, you have to structure how you're going to do that. And all of these things enhance critical thinking. Some of the other studies that I found also show that when students create podcasts, what they normally call student generated podcasts, they have definitely led to measurable gains, specifically in critical thinking skills. And why is that? Primarily because learners have to plan an entire podcast. Sometimes they are required to script the entire podcast, and of course, all of them require some sort of revision. And all these three things, the planning, the scripting, and the revising of podcasts, definitely promote metacognitive awareness. Why is that? Because students are going to be constantly reflecting on what they already know and how they can communicate it effectively, which we will see later on, that aligns very much with the entire task-based language teaching cycle. And I went a little bit further. We're still number two. I went a little bit further to talk more, to explore more, and this is what I did for my master's, is I wanted to see how other subjects were also dealing with podcast. And I found some very interesting, some very insightful research on podcast projects in science courses. And a lot of students in science courses have done podcasting as part of assessment as well. And the research has suggested that this kind of podcast project has definitely improved the learning outcomes. A lot of students have suggested that they have definitely improved their communication skills, because they're forced to communicate more effectively. And I think one of the most important ones for us as language educators is it increased the student satisfaction in the classroom, even though podcasting in itself, the project in itself, can be quite challenging. Not to mention the fact that podcasting also encourages analytical thinking, which we all know it will move students beyond what we would call this rote memorization of language. So they are actively engaged with language, they're actively producing language, and all of this leads to this development of critical thinking and reflection. The next benefit is in terms of creativity and digital literacy, which was something that I wasn't very surprised, to be quite frank, because from my perspective and from the research that we have done, podcasting does enable creative expression. And this can be done through a variety of tasks. It could be through storytelling, it could be through informal discussions, or any other type of engaging formats. And I'm going to be looking at different types of tasks that we can use for podcasting. What is also very important for me to mention is that the research also highlights that podcasting in itself does enhance their ability to tell better stories. It also helps them with the logical sequencing of ideas in narrative forms. And in terms of digital literacy, what the research has shown is that it definitely does build what we would call digital literacy. And Andrew shared a story with, I think it was Nathan or Martin Cook, where, it's challenging for students to go through all of the stages of recording audio, editing audio, because podcasting will help them beyond language. They will acquire skills that go beyond language, because they're going to learn how to use recording and editing tools. And as a result, they will also enhance their technology skills, which I think is very much aligned with the theme of the conference. alongside, of course, their academic development. And from a producer perspective, Andrew and I have been podcasting for quite a long time now. Developing podcasts do require researching, as I said. You have to do a lot of outlining, scripting, editing. Rehearsing, we don't really do. We like just go on the fly and we just wing it. We never rehearse for a podcast. But I think right here we can see that there is this blend between technical and creative skills. And what the research has also shown is that students themselves often find podcast projects to be highly motivating, which makes them more engaged and, of course, more invested in their work. So, in an age where students are constantly distracted, it's very difficult to engage them, to get their attention. I think if we give them ownership, if we give them something like a podcast project, which is highly motivating, will definitely help them become more invested and buy into the whole idea of learning the language. Which leads us to the next benefit of podcasting, which is the idea of increasing student autonomy and engagement. The research that we looked at shows that podcasting assignments specifically, they increase. I think that's the best word. They have definitely increased student ownership of learning in comparison to the more traditional assignments where they have to just, I don't know, I'm looking at college assignments and university assignments in the institutions that we both work at, and a lot of their assignments are what's so-called traditional assignments, and we have seen very little work being done in terms of giving students assignments that will increase their ownership of learning. What the research has also confirmed is that by engaging in autonomous tasks or autonomy will definitely lead to more motivation. Why is that? Because students enjoy directing their own projects, and as a result, they will put in more effort. And in addition to that, I would also argue that knowing that their work will be shared with an audience, and this could be only their classmates, it definitely increases their accountability and the focus on the quality of their projects. And we're going to look at a bunch of other case studies that Andrew is going to talk about. But I had a chance to look at other case studies across different education levels. And what I have found is that there's definitely higher engagement and more collaboration when using podcast projects. And one interesting study that I found was this one where I was looking at the format of podcasting and how this very specific format benefits shy students, those more introverted students who don't seem to want to participate as much in class. Why is that? Because it allows them to be, once again, invested in the entire project, invested in the entire task, because it allows them to script and record podcasts at their own pace, which of course reduces anxiety compared to what we would say a live presentation. So those are the 4 benefits. We're going to get to the last one, which is the idea of active learning versus purely passive consumption of content, which is what we normally see in traditional classrooms here in Canada and probably around the world, where what we see is that when we assign students a podcasting project, what happens is we're shifting the students. They're moving away from the kinds of people who are just in the classroom sitting and being passive note takers, and we're transforming them into active knowledge creators. And we are in an era of knowledge creation. We're content creators, as we like to say. And what's also very important about podcasting, as I've mentioned earlier in our session, is that it does align with a lot of constructivist learning principles. Why? Because students are students are constructing understanding by doing. They're not learning and then doing it. They're learning by doing. And the research that I have seen in higher education specifically has highlighted that podcasting fosters collaboration, it improves communication, and also enhances problem solving skills. In addition to that, creating a podcast also involves, as I said, research, sometimes debate, sometimes interviews, editing. All of these require, as we all know, deeper cognitive engagement as opposed to passive listening or just reading. And some interesting reports from teachers, the ones in the classroom, they have also reported that podcasts provide what they would describe as a welcome break from text heavy coursework, where they would just hop on the syllabus and it's horse track English. Let's finish the syllabus, let's finish the course, and let's go. But podcasting has definitely improved that. It increased the curiosity and the involvement of students. And perhaps the most important benefit in terms of active learning is that this active role that students will start playing when they engage in podcasting is that it will definitely enhance what we describe as student driven learning, because it definitely makes learning more enjoyable. So when we think about it, the benefits of podcasting in education are very strong, enhancing listening and comprehension skills, development of critical thinking and reflection, improving creativity and digital literacy, student autonomy and engagement, and active learning. I think we have a very robust body of evidence to suggest that we should be using podcasting as a task type in language teaching and language education. And now we're going to get to podcasting in task-based language teaching. Before we jump right into this, has anyone ever used? I know Audrey is doesn't count because she does podcasting with her students, but has anyone out there ever used podcasting as a project in the classroom?
Really, except Malay is here now. She just joined us, so she's not in it because Malay and I are studying that class. But in the room, it seems like nobody else is using podcasting for now.
I think that's definitely what we're trying to, I wouldn't say push, but we're trying to open doors here, specifically in North America, specifically in Canada, because we find that the assignments that students are being given are still very much the traditional assignments. And Andrew and I thought if we could combine our passion for podcasting with our desire for pushing task-based language teaching to be much stronger in North America, then we can do that. And this is the reason why we're doing this session. So let's look into podcasting in TBLT. There are a couple of things about podcasting. I would say, first of all, that podcasting does fit task-based language teaching. Task-based language teaching, as we all know, it emphasizes using language to complete real tasks as opposed to drilling specific forms. And podcasting in itself is inherently communicative. Why? Because learners are using language to convey ideas with a real audience in mind. And I would say this is probably one of the reasons why podcasting is an authentic and goal driven task, which, in our opinion, is perfectly aligned with the principles of TBLT. And when we think about creating a podcast, right? The key features of a podcast, perhaps in TBLT, creating a podcast, which is the next slide, Andrew. When we look at the key features of podcast tasks in task based language teaching, we have to think about a couple of things. We have to consider a couple of important things. When we think about creating a podcast, there's a little bit of push, and I'm not going to, of course, mention Swain's pushed output here, but it definitely pushes students to plan. It definitely pushes students to negotiate meaning, and it definitely pushes students to express their ideas more clearly. And whether or not they're going to be working in pairs, they're going to be working in small groups, what they will naturally do is they will collaborate to produce an outcome. And this outcome is an episode. And when we look at the work, and we actually had Jane Willis on the podcast. I think she was on the podcast a couple of years ago, but we've also had Mariah on the podcast. We've had Lara Bryfonski. We've had a lot of TBLTers on the podcast as well. I would say that all of this aligns with Jane Willis's view that tasks do encourage learners to communicate with each other to achieve something meaningful. And I think that's perhaps one of the main reasons why I think we should really be thinking as podcasting as a task type, which leads to the next part, which is looking at the motivation and autonomy. And even when, and I remember being asked this question once. Someone said, "Leo, but can you do podcasting alone?" Yes, even when done individually, podcasting is motivating. I've done some podcasting by myself. Andrew has done recordings on his own, and we find that students know that their work will be heard. And knowing that their work will be heard by someone else, whether by peers or even a wider audience, as I said before, this increases ownership and it increases their personal investment in the task. And I remember there was one speaker in 2019 in that conference who talked about task investment, because what they're doing is they're not just completing an assignment, they are actually producing something real, an artifact, a language artifact. And of course, when we look at the TBLT cycle in podcasting, which is what we're going to get to next in the next slide, we can see that the TBLT structure is also reflected in podcasting. I would argue that podcasting creation mirrors the task cycle because students have to prepare, they have to perform, and they have to reflect, just like in a classic TBLT framework. And of course, these stages guide them through meaningful use of language. And of course, they do support the development of both, well, not both, of fluency, accuracy, and I would add the third one there, which is the complexity through, of course, real world engagement. So the argument that podcasting is not related to TBLT to me is faulty because the cycle is there. So let's move on now to some common task types in podcast projects. So yes, here we have different types of tasks. I have tried to play along with some of these. I haven't used all of these, but when we think about podcasting, I would say, as I said, podcasting lends itself naturally to a variety of task types that align very well with the principles of task-based language teaching, especially tasks that are meaning focused, goal oriented, and communicative. So I'm going to give you some solid examples of task types that align with podcasting. The first one is information sharing or reporting tasks. And this would be very simple. Learners could do research on a very specific topic. For example, this could be a cultural tradition, a global issue, a scientific concept, and they can create an episode explaining it to their peers. And what I like about this is that you can emphasize clarity, you have summarizing skills there, you have some paraphrasing, audience awareness as well. So information sharing is definitely one example of a task type that aligns with podcasting. Another one would be opinion and argumentation tasks. In this case, what would happen is students would just simply record a podcast giving their opinions on a controversial topic or responding to a classmate's argument. And I'm going to give you one example that I've used recently with one of my classes in first year college. We were talking about the negative impact of social media, specifically TikTok, and how Australia was banning TikTok. And I asked my students to read the article, and then I asked them to record a 3-minute podcast giving their opinions. And of course, they had to support that with their point, they had to give an example, and then they had to explain. So what I found is that a lot of the students, by doing this very simple task, as opposed to normally doing it in writing, is that they were able to develop their skills primarily in terms of persuasion, in terms of justification, and of course, expressing their stance more clearly. So opinion and argumentation tasks, they work really well with the TBLT cycle as well. Moving on to the third one, and this is the one that Andrew and I have done extensively, which is interview tasks, which we will be doing one today, by the way. But learners, basically in an interview task, what happens is learners are basically preparing and conducting interviews. And those interviews can be interview with classmates, could be an interview with a teacher, with a guest, And then, of course, they have to edit the audio into an episode of a podcast. And what I really like about this type of task is that it encourages authentic question formation. It encourages turn taking. It encourages also active listening. So, interview tasks are great for that. Then the fourth task type would be storytelling or personal narrative tasks. And I've had one teacher telling me that she has used this task type with her students, where basically they would create a narrative podcast episode. So you could give students a prompt, a moment that changed my life, or a cultural misunderstanding when I first moved to the Netherlands. And then they would have to tell that story. And as I think we can say that it's fair to say that this kind of task will definitely build fluency, will build their sequencing, their past tense narration, and of course, their use of expressive language. And in terms of another task type would be problem solving or discussion tasks. And I haven't had a chance to do much of this, but ideally what you would do is you would have to get students to work in groups for this. And they would discuss a real world issue, I don't know, climate change, as I said, social media use, and then they would propose solutions to these problems in a podcast panel format. And what I find fascinating about this type of task is that it not only encourages the negotiation of meaning, you might even have to use some conditional structures, but it also fosters what Neil Mercer describes as collaborative dialogue. So that's another good one.
Can even be like a seminar type task, eh, Leo? You do
Exactly.
seminars, it kind of mirrors that a little bit.
Absolutely. The only problem is the editing.
Tell me.
Which leads us to the number 6 here, which is reflective and tasks or metacognitive tasks, where I've done this in writing and I'm going to do it this year. I'm finishing a course right now. I'm going to ask my students to reflect on their learning experience throughout the semester, on their language goals or their challenges, but they're going to do this in an audio journal format. And what do I like about this? It supports self-awareness. It supports the kind of vocabulary for emotion and thought. And of course, it also supports fluency in informal speech. I didn't include a number 7 there, but number 7 would be creative production tasks. I have a lot of students that I worked with who are very interested in crime stories, sci-fi news show, historical reenactments. So one example of a creative production task that we can use with our students would be they would create a fictional podcast. And I would argue that this also promotes this imaginative language use. You might have to create some dialogue writing. And of course, it would also emphasize genre specific conventions. All right, so let's move on to, yeah, we've passed that. Yeah, so podcasts, yeah, we're moving on. We've passed that. Yeah, so what do we students do when they are podcasting? There are a couple of stages involved in podcasting. And the first one is that they have to brainstorm, they have to categorize, they have to sequence all of the content that they are going to be using in the podcast. After that, they also have to outline, they have to write scripts, they have to structure all the podcast segments that they're going to be using. And Andrew and I have both discussed this, and we both believe that through doing number 1 and number 2, they will naturally, because this is something that happened to us as podcasters, is we definitely developed our discourse organization and our coherence when speaking. And I would also argue that script writing in itself improves structure and language output. In terms of other task types, let's move on to, yeah, so expressing personal opinions through dialogues. We've talked about this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this here. But as I said, students can always share, justify their personal views. They practice spontaneous speech. All of that can be done through podcasting. Let's move on to the next one, Andrew. Problem solving, yes. So podcasting, I would argue, provides a wonderful platform for students to simulate the real world issue analysis. And this can be done in teams or individually, and they can tackle problems, they can propose solutions, they can express ideas using a wide range of language functions. And it's an engaging way to practice purposeful and solution focused dialogue, which leads us to the next one, which is the creative production and synthesis of ideas. As I said, when we're dealing with a podcast, everything culminates in a final product. There's always an engaging audio episode. So students have to synthesize the input, which is the research, the interview, the ideas, into output. And as I said, this encourages creativity and diverse language use, and of course fosters pride, deeper learning, and language refinement. So when it comes to this, what we're seeing is it's the process requires integrating multiple skills. So in a way, I'm going to go back here to one of my favorite task-based language teaching resources, which is a 2009 book by, I don't know if they're at the conference, Virginia Samuda and Bygate.
They're not. They are not.
They're not. Oh, I definitely want to get them. I want to get Samuda on the podcast, by the way. So if you guys know her contact number or email, send them to me. But they talk about tasks as holistic activities, as educative tasks. And I like that because when I think about podcasting, it's a process that requires integrating multiple skills. You're not just focusing on listening or focusing on reading or focusing on writing or focusing on speaking. You're integrating multiple skills. You have summarizing, you have narrating, you have scripting, and even adding those creative touches. So you have things that go beyond the language. And my argument, my contention, is that this not only solidifies learning, but it also pushes students to use the language in more diverse and more personal ways. So let's talk a little bit more about authentic tasks with clear communicative outcomes. And I'll start with a quote, also a quote that I learned about this quote from the Samuda and Bygate book, where it's John Dewey in his 1913, such a great book. I actually got a copy of it, Interest and Effort in Education, which was published in Toronto. I just found out recently. And he talks about if by a task we mean something that it has to be overcome, then children, youth, and adults require tasks in order to have continued development. And if one means by a task something that has no interest, makes no appeal, then the matter is quite different. So he calls these tasks where students will have some sort of development educative because they supply, as he describes, an indispensable stimulus to thinking and to reflective inquiry. And in the book, Samud and Bygate, of course, they didn't say this, but I plugged it in there. I would argue, based on their definition of holistic task, that podcasting is a holistic task in the sense that it involves the learner's knowledge of different sub areas of language, but also other areas, other skills, not just phonology, grammar, vocabulary, and discourse to make meanings, but it goes beyond that. As I said, it involves summarizing, narrating, scripting, adding creative touches, and of course, all of these sub areas of language. So, why is podcasting an authentic, holistic task? There are a couple of reasons for that. I would first argue by saying that podcasting mirrors real life communication in the sense that students take on the role of real podcasters, and then they have to create content with a very clear communicative purpose. And this, of course, makes the task feel more relevant and feel more motivating. So instead of the pretend classroom talk where they don't have a clear audience, where they are not talking about something that has a clear purpose, what they're doing in podcasting is they are producing something that could, in theory, of course, be shared with the world, but it can also be shared with their peers. Let's talk about clear communicative outcomes with podcasting, which is the next one. So, one of the central tenets of task based language teaching, as we all know, is that it's having a communicative outcome. With podcasting, that outcome is very clear. It's an audio product that needs to inform, that needs to entertain, that needs to persuade a very specific audience. And this clarity helps students understand the why behind their language use. And I think understanding the why behind their language use is extremely important in terms of investment. And of course, it also directs them towards purposeful communication. Let's look at a couple of examples from the classroom. And this is a couple of different examples that I found in the literature and real classroom examples showing how podcasting brings learning to life. In one project, the one that I looked at, students had to share global issues through podcasts. And this was a very effective way of teaching one another about these very specific issues. And that was part of their assessment. In another one, this one with science students, they were asked to record podcasts for a general audience. In this case, what we had here is they were required to adapt their language because they're speaking to a more general audience. And of course, when we look at podcasting, we're thinking these are not just speaking tasks. To me, they are acts of real communication. Which brings us to podcasts as assessment tasks. As I said, and Andrew is going to talk more about this, podcasting also works as a valid alternative assessment tool. And a lot of the research shows that students, as I said before, they find it more engaging, they find it less stressful than the traditional speaking exams. And the product, which is the episode, still demonstrates their speaking ability, but I would argue that their ability is showcased in a more natural and in a more motivating way. And finally, podcasting to me, it's real communication with a real impact. And ultimately, podcasting leads students to use language, as I said, for a real purpose because they're not just completing an assignment. They are sharing ideas, they are collaborating, and they're building skills that matter beyond the classroom. And the research supports what we often see: more engagement, better performance, and more meaningful learning. Andrew is going to move on now to talk about some of the case studies that we have for this session.
All right, for sure. So let's walk through a couple of things. We don't have everything documented that we've done with our students in classes, but we have three case studies that we'll share with you here. And then the fourth one, we're happy that Audrey will share one of her case studies as well. And going through different ranges of how we've used this, more from the first one, which is more just holistic, I would say, to actually using it as assessment. So the first one is, well, I said at the beginning, our Teacher Talkie Time podcast is primarily for teachers as a CPD tool and to learn about research and to disseminate research, which is true. We did create, I forget the year, Leo, but maybe it was during the pandemic, 2021, 2022, something like that.
Around that time, yeah.
A mini series specifically geared towards learners of, I suppose, any language, although we did it in English, so learners of English, let's say, as part of the main podcast. And you can see the banner there called the Cult of Learning series. And it was specifically for learners as podcasts use extensive listening in the wild, as we called it. And it was an 18 episode series. I just highlighted four of the titles here on the screen that you can see a range of what types of things that we discussed in those episodes. The art of noticing language was one. What are habits and the science behind them? SMART goals for effective language learning. Fear, which is just the title of an episode. And each one dedicated was about 20 minutes, I would say. to one specific topic, and we really dived into topics that I hope were motivating for the students, but in a way that wasn't instructive, but just discussed a holistic, meaningful topic and allowed them to digest the information. One of the actually ones that really resonated, I didn't actually put it here. Leo, if you remember, it was called The Art of Having a Conversation or Mastering the Art of Having a Conversation, where we went through a framework that students could apply. And the feedback we got from students on that one was excellent. Before I go to the next slide, I've cut just a little bit of an audio from one of the episodes of Leo's voice, and we can probably tell the difference a little bit in our microphone quality between today and that time, but just to give a sense of what that sounded like and get a sense of what what their purpose was. I hope the audio will come through the Zoom, but let's see. It's about 20 seconds or so.
Welcome to the Teacher Talking Time podcast for language learners, the cult of learning. The aim of our series is actually very simple: to encourage humans, language learners, to find and pursue that thing that they're passionate about when they're learning a foreign language. This podcast, the Cult of Learning series, are episodes for learners of languages. Are you learning English? Then this is the podcast for you. In these episodes, we discuss all kinds of things. We discuss tools and strategies for learning, as well as trying to provide opportunities for you to actually practice your listening. And here we are in our latest episode 13.
And that's Leo, yeah.
I was going to say my podcasting voice got a lot better.
You didn't talk about any of the challenges of podcasting, but the biggest one, I think, is if you're doing it, is learning to enjoy the sound of your own voice, because that is a journey for sure. But finding a voice is important. I think we got a comment recently from someone that said they listened to an old episode of ours, and while it was good, his feedback was that you guys have really found your voice recently, which was a very nice compliment, I think. You do.
Which in the research, I also found that a lot of students have reported that they found their voice in the language after podcasting as well.
It's very interesting. So that was like an introduction in how Leo would introduce the show each time and the purpose of it. And then whatever the topic was, we would dive into it. And yeah, we did 18 episodes in this series, and they're all dedicated to what we called self-learning or self-guided learning. This wasn't part of a course. This was not part of a program. It was just podcasts that we released into our feed where and we shared them with students that we knew and asked them to share with other people, but it was not, as you would define it, as an official program or course, just out into the world. And anyone who was interested in learning a language could listen and do extensive listening, do some tasks, do some reflection. And each episode had a very specific goal. It asked students, as we went through, to pause and complete a task along the way. And it really allowed them to take ownership of the content and the message. So in episodes about fear, for example, I remember we talked about fear of mistakes, fear that come up with learning a language, and kind of asking them to jot down or think of what they were afraid of in terms of progressing and learning the language. But it really allowed them to take ownership, which I think is great and really involved in that TBLT framework as well. And each episode really was focused on something specific that they could walk away or take away from that episode. And that's one series that we ran. And then we were actually able to use that or leverage that through something else that we designed. And then this was during the pandemic, and we designed something that's called the SDLP, or the Self-Directed Learning Portal. And this was something that we sold, a product, a course, I guess we could say, that we designed, and we used the podcast inside of it to help give students more scaffolded support so they could engage with the podcast on Spotify on their own as anyone normally would. Or within this, if they were inside the course, we scaffolded podcasting tasks through a more direct or self-guided manner. So how it worked was this was a tool that they could log into online, and we used the podcast as input to expand and direct their learning in that sense. Leo and I talk a lot about listening as the Cinderella skill in language learning, where in a lot of places, students are exposed to text in terms of their listening, but not actually taught how to listen. They're usually tested on their listening skills. So we designed this in a way that hopefully it's scaffolded that they would be able to improve and actually learn the skill of listening through podcasts. So some of the tasks ask them for ideas, to transcribe, to notice language. Then they ask them to apply the topic of the podcast or their own takeaways from it in their own context. And it always ended with a communicative task. And it came with a task journal or a listening journal that partly looks like this. And there were 8 tasks or 8 steps to complete as they went through each episode, all hopefully geared towards building autonomy, independence. Yes, learning the skill of listening, but being able to take from the podcast what they felt was meaningful for them. So at the very beginning, they just put their name, the name of the podcast, the episode, and sentences why they chose it. In this case, we're giving it to them, but in theory, this is transferable. So when they're just choosing any podcast that they wanted to listen to, they would explain it there. And then going through the first task, which is prediction or before listening. And the 8 tasks that journal walks them through are here. So prediction first. So based on the title, the image, create some prediction questions to see what you think you will hear. A calibration task to adjust to speaker's voice, potential accent, speed, etc. A third task to listen for confirmation. So we're confirming if your predictions were correct. If so, how many? Then a task on listening for some of the details on those confirmation. In the confirmation task, we usually just ask them yes, no. So in the prediction, predict 5 things that, based on the title, you think the speaker will discuss or the podcast will discuss. In task 3, which ones of those did the speaker talk about? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then in task 4, listen again for the details. And this can be toggled up and down depending on the proficiency level of the
There was
learner.
a lot of, from what I remember, Andrew, there was a lot of input tasks and output tasks as part of this.
Absolutely. Yes. And then moving into beyond what you would say is the main idea. So asking the learner to choose relevant vocabulary or chunks from the episode that they want to use more, that they found were interesting, and do some vocabulary tasks with those. A transcription task, so choosing, let's say, a 20-second excerpt. If the proficiency level is lower, maybe choose a 5 or 6 second up to 20 seconds and transcribe exactly what they hear. We provided the transcription of the full episode in the portal so they could confirm afterwards if they were correct or not correct. A personalization task, which is the communicative task at the end, asking them to either record their voice, create a video, or a written task based on what they learned. And then a reflection at the end based to assess their or self-assess their own listening skills based on their experience with this podcast. And we gave them some prompts to rank themselves, that they thought this was great, that they were very good at it, they were okay at it, or they need improvement, and helping them create a plan to improve that. So that's how we use podcasting in that SDLP portal during the pandemic. And then the third case study here was a really wonderful opportunity that was brought to us after the TBLT conference in 2019, where we worked with Dr. Eva Karchava at Carleton as part of her MA class. And this is one way that podcasting can be used as assessment. So she invited us to be a part of and to produce and to facilitate, I guess is the word, creating podcasts with her MA class on corrective feedback. And she wanted, her idea, she had never done it before, but she wanted to have her students do a podcast as an arc, assessment arc in the class. And they would actually interview scholars from the reading list, if I understood it correctly. And each student would be paired up with another student, and they collectively interviewed 8 amazing scholars, researchers on corrective feedback, who you can see on the screen here. Eva Kachava is there, Hossein Nasaji, who's also here in Canada, on the West Coast in the University of Victoria, at least at the time, Naomi Starch, Pilar Garcia del Mayo, and many others who were awesome contributors to the show. And basically, each student or pair of students would go through that process that Leo basically outlined earlier. where they would pre-task would be to plan, right? They would be assigned the scholar that they would be interviewing. They would read articles based on or articles written by that person, find some points that they wanted to focus the interview on, scripting questions, not scripting a whole script, of course, planning some questions to ask. They would then conduct the interview, carry it out, and then in the post task or the post interview was to reflect and review what went well, how it could be better, and then of course our role was to help put it together and release it to the world. And this was done as an assessment for the course. I don't have entire clarity on how Ava exactly invoked that assessment, but I do know that the pre-interview was one mini assessment, doing the interview was one mini assessment, and then the post-interview reflection task, which I believe was a written task that they submitted, was also part of the assessment as well. And it really just, this whole experience brings together what Leo talked about earlier, where that process of podcasting as assessment within a TBLT framework can be achieved. And this, I think, is a really nice case study to show how it worked. And this wasn't something that was a short term, I think it was basically over the entire semester. So I believe it was the fall semester. So we met with her class probably in the very first week of the course, early September or something like that, and gave some support, gave some tutorial on how to plan a podcast, how to create some questions, what they should be looking for. We attended each of the interviews, we recorded them, gave some help where needed, but the students were great. They were able to hold the interview. And then interviews were scheduled over the course of the semester, so over a 2-month period or so. And then we were able to release them towards the end of the semester or early in January as well. So really going through each of those stages of the framework that Leo mentioned. And yeah, the post task or the meaningfulness of it is, as Leo said, now the MA students were not language learners per se, but anyone, I think we can agree that anytime you tell your learners that they have to share this idea with somebody else, or they have to give a mini presentation, or that it will be released somehow, there's more effort involved and there's more motivation to do it. And so all of these episodes were released. They are still live. They're released on our channel and on the Carleton website as well. And it's a pretty cool, I guess one nice thing about podcasting, if you do release them, is that it becomes this time capsule into a time. And you could delete them, but if you don't, they're just there. And you can reflect and you can go back to them and you can remember them, and they can always be contributing in whatever capacity it is. So those episodes are there. There's 8 of them. And I'm completely biased, but I think they're pretty good. I think they're pretty good. And that is 3 case studies that we've run through using podcasting. The first 2 as a learning tool, this one as an assessment. I know Ava's not attending this year. I wish she were, that she could probably explain from her side. That would be interesting, her reflection on this. But I know she's contacted us again and she wants to do this again. Seems to have gone on. She's enjoyed it. Also, we thank her. Big thank you to her for bringing that idea to us and thinking outside the box in terms of assessments, because at the time, that was the first time I'd heard of anyone doing this. And speaking of assessments, we have one more case study, and Audrey is so kind as to share her experience doing this as well.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's funny that so long time you talked about self-directed learning, because we have, Malay and I are working with a PhD student who is working on the idea of self-directed tasks with this idea that when students create their own task or have more of an agency in what they create, that would have a positive impact on their learning. And for me, podcasting has been answering a practical teaching issue that I had. So I don't know if you know that, but here at this university, we take a usage-based perspective to language learning and teaching, which means that we expose our students to a lot of language or information, and that they learn by doing something, by repeating a lot, iteration, etc. And we also have a strong TBLT framework. So in that perspective, podcasting was solving my problems, which was teaching French here in the Netherlands so not in the country where you were exposed to the language, pushed me to find exposure differently. And in 2018, we were lucky enough to have enough material in the wild, like you said, so on the internet, that was authentic. And so we could use those and have our students learn French through films, but also podcasting. And then we asked them to create podcasts themselves as a task. Level B2, C1, we asked our students to create podcasts. I think the puzzle that had to be solved there was the assessment. So how do you assess a group work? Because we did ask to do it in a group for the same reasons you mentioned before. It's a collaborative work, so you also learn a lot by organizing together. There is a lot of negotiation of meaning. And for me as a teacher, it's also 3 times less podcasts to listen to and grade. So it's very practical reason. And it is true that it has a lot of benefits, but it also has the pitfall that some students wanted to be graded or assessed individually as well. A group grade is sometimes considered by students as, not representing their level, depending on the group they are. So we paired the podcast itself with a reflective writing assignment. And this one was individual. And after that, we went one step further and we wanted to have a multimodal way of offering references, sources, academic, scientific articles. And that was also because we realized that this generation of students don't only learn by reading things, and there were a lot on the go. There were a lot doing, there were a lot running or whatever. And so sitting somewhere to read something, even watch a movie of more than an hour, was challenging for them. But I still wanted them to engage with the literature and to engage with scientific findings and data. So the idea of using podcasts started there. And it was facilitated by the fact that people like you guys do a terrific work in producing the podcasts that are scientifically sounded as well. So it's based on literature, it's based on sources. It's quite formal, but informal at the same time. And so if there were only podcasts that were not very seriously made or not telling or talking about results or facts, we wouldn't use them in academia. But now in 2025, there are more and more podcasts that are academically sound. So we started to use them for our classes as well. And the project you want me to talk about, I think, is the one where I invite you guys to come to my class and tell about podcasting. And that's a bit of an inception kind of opportunity because so we teach future teachers here. And it's a course that I teach together with Marai. And we had a second problem to solve in our teaching. And that was that we are teaching language teachers, future language teachers from different languages. So 2 will become Spanish language teachers, 2 will become German language teachers, 3 or 4 will become English language teachers or French language teachers. And we needed an assignment in which they will also use the language they are studying and teach them all together in the same class. So a highly multilingual component was there as well. And we found podcasting, because it offers the opportunity to edit things, as being really interesting for them. So they could do a multilingual podcast, one part in Spanish, one part in English. They could record it. They could, if it was on video, subtitle it, or they would have a script translated into another language. And that's a good example of how technology can solve a problem of teaching. So we didn't do podcasting just because we wanted to do podcasting. We had a teaching problem and we solved it through the choice of podcasting at that moment. And what was important in that course was to realized that it has a lot of benefits. But for some students, it was intimidating to have a podcast as a final assignment because of the amount of technology that it needs. And also in most students' idea, producing a podcast, editing is very complicated.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
That
yeah.
is time consuming. I think that they knew that too. And that was also worrying them a lot because they have so many hours for a class and not more. So the solution here is a solution that I use always when I introduce new technology into a classroom, is that I allocate time during my course to teach them how to use the technology and to train with them. So at the University of Groningen, there was an explosion of people wanting to podcast. All of a sudden, after COVID-19, everybody wanted to podcast. It has a reason. It's because we did a lot of online teaching and a lot of what they called the flipping the classroom idea. And when you flip the classroom, you need a task for your students to do at home, to share it with the rest. And during classroom time, you give a bit of feedback, you discuss the feedback, and they work on a better version, something like this. So the university here invested in a lot of material for podcasting. We have a podcast studio here. We have
Oh, wow.
4 mobile podcast sets. So they really invested in that. And our students and our staff can use this material for teaching, but also research. Yeah. And after a while, when I teach the students, so I just take 20 minutes each class for 4 weeks, I think. First, to show them how the podcast studio works. Then they record themselves on their iPhone and they export the sound file. After that, they try on the podcast sets. They play the jingles. That's where I like what you said about the creativity. And it's true, some of them, not all of them, but some of them really appreciate the fact that they will be able to create a nice little intro. And their choice for music is also very interesting every time. And the jingles, so some podcasts have almost no jingles or extra little thing, and other podcasts have a lot of sounds, like funny sounds or serious sounds, and that's their individual and what they brought into the podcasts. That's their individual creativity. To grade them, Mariah and I developed a rubric, and for those who are interested, we have been sharing it. When people emailed us, we have been sharing that rubric with anyone who wanted to have it. And I have never found it very difficult with that rubric to grade the podcasts. And so the assessment part has been solved quite quickly in our case. But that is because we don't have a lot of students. So when they team up, I have to grade maybe 5 or 6 podcasts, and that's okay. But if you have a classroom of, you have to grade 30 podcasts, then you have to think of the way you grade them. Maybe it's not a final grade, but you will have to use it as peer feedback on them. But there is always a way, in my opinion, to have them do the exercise, and because they learn a lot from it as well. In learning, what is beautiful about learning is when you have a challenging task, something difficult, and you overcome the difficulty, there is a boost in your confidence. That's how you build your confidence. Most of my students in that class start the class being intimidated by podcasting. But because it takes 7 weeks, more or less, where we help them through it, when the university had money, we even have an assistant who helped them outside of the class with the podcast. And at the end of 7 weeks, they all produced one podcast episode. Some of them were published on your platform, and they were very proud of that. all of them are published on our platform of the university. So the fact that will be listened by other people motivates them to produce good work as well. But they are very proud that they overcome this difficulty. And most of them at the end say, it was not as difficult as I thought. Actually, it was even the editing part with we use Audacity, which is not the best program, but it's just very easy and it's just enough to do what they need to do. And a lot of them came to me and said, I started my own podcast. After this class, I decided that and it's not about a subject from university, it's a personal subject they're passionate about. But yeah, and it's not everyone, but I've had the case for sure.
I have a question on the assessment, Audrey.
go
So
ahead.
did you assess just the final product, or was it mini assessments as you went through the course, like check-ins along the way?
I assessed the final product, but there were, because we adopt a task-based we adopt a task-based framework also outside of language courses. So this is a course about education, about the CEFR. And I have another course about linguistics, but I still use the TBLT framework for these courses. There is a pre-task activities, if you want, where in the classroom, they have to give a heads up of what they have been doing until now, and I can give them feedback or suggestions about how to go further. Usually what's very important in the very beginning, when they think about their guests, who they will invite on the podcast, and the outline and their topic, what they're going to talk about. So I know that this is the moment where I have to be there and I have to give them feedback at that moment.
That's good. I think all of that speaks for the value of podcasting, especially as you said, like in terms of engagement. And I think Martha is going to talk a little bit about that and willingness to communicate, students gaining confidence, finding their voice through podcasting. I think that's great. I think all of these case studies, in a way, they support everything that we have described as some of the most important benefits of podcasting in language education. Andrew, what's next? What do we have there? We have, I think, a little reflection before we jump into yes, we have some self-reflection here before we jump into our recording of the podcasting. The first question, I think it's an important one, is what role do you see podcasting playing in helping your students developing these skills, digital literacy, autonomy, and the transferability of communication skills that go or that extend perhaps beyond the classroom? I think that would be the first reflection question. The second one would be, in terms of, as you've mentioned there, Audrey, what challenges do you think you're going to encounter? What opportunities do you foresee in terms of the implementation of podcast-based tasks in your own teaching context? Do you have the resources? How are you going to scaffold the assessment? I think for us, what we see is in North America is that people are still very conservative when it comes to innovating with these kinds of assessments. We're still in the stone age of assessment here, in a way, unfortunately, but we're trying to change that. And the last one is in terms of leveraging. How can we leverage podcasting as a low barrier, high impact technology to promote the kind of authentic communication and learner engagement that we want to provide within the context that we teach? And I was even looking at the program, and I saw that there are some very interesting talks. There was one on the use of Instagram in a task-based approach. I saw someone talking about life lessons, learner agency, and developing podcasts. It was a TBLT for remote Australian Aboriginal students. We definitely want to talk to Rhonda. I think it's Rhonda, her name. And I know Martha is going to talk about games as collaborative tasks, and she's going to be looking in terms of efficacy, engagement, and of course, willingness to communicate. But these are good reflections for all of us to bear in mind, to keep in mind as we look at podcasting in terms of a task type. And I know we might be a little bit ahead of our times here. I know Andrew and I were talking about this. We're trying to see if we can pitch this to schools and to universities and colleges in Canada to see if they can start looking at podcasting as a better form of assessment, one that actually leads to better learning. And what do we have there? Oh, the references. If you want to download our references, you just have to use your QR code here. We don't use papers anymore in Canada, so just scan that if you want. This is going to be available online. We're going to be sharing the video with the TBLT folks. And we're going to be posting this on our YouTube channel. And this is also going to become the surprises coming up. Ruined the surprise within the first 10 minutes by announcing it, but I don't think people were paying attention. But what do we have next? I think it's a surprise now. Yes, we have a little surprise. So since we're talking about podcasting, Andrew and I said, you know what? We want to have fun. We want to do this and we want to enjoy it. So why not do a live podcasting from the TBLT conference since we couldn't be there? Our goal was to do the podcasting there, but it didn't happen. So we're going to do a live podcast episode today. And we have two surprise guests. So welcome back. We are going to, as part of our session, we've decided that it would be a great idea to actually do a live podcast recording. So today we are honored to have two wonderful guests here with us today. And I'm not going to introduce them as I usually do on the podcast. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to each other because I think they haven't met each other before. So we have Scott Thornbury with us here online, and in Groningen with Audrey, we have Marta Lorenz. Did I pronounce that right? I don't know if I got your name correct here. Andrew, maybe your Spanish is better than mine.
Marta Gonzalez Loret, I believe. Yes.
Gonzalez Loret. All right, so I'll let Scott introduce himself and then Martha, and then we'll jump right in.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm based, as Leo says, I'm based in Spain, and I have been for a number of years. I'm a teacher trainer, essentially, ex-teacher, and writer of books on methodology and books on language, and editor of books on methodology for Cambridge University Press. And I suppose it's worth saying that I'm associated with, for better or worse, with the movement called Dogma or Teaching Unplugged, which emerged about nearly 25 years ago, in fact. So we're celebrating our anniversary with a new book, which has just come out. Yeah, so that's me.
Martha?
Hello, my name is Marta Gonzalez Lloret, and I'm based at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And I've been involved in TBLT for quite a long time. I was a student of Mike Long while he was at the University of Hawaii. And I've been part of the AA TBLT Association. And yeah, I work mainly with TBLT and technology. This podcast is right up my alley, although I am not a podcaster. I don't have a voice for it.
Oh, come on. You will develop your voice. It comes with practice.
But he says, we said that at the beginning too. So everyone's.
Yeah. 7 years later, and here we are. Thank you for being here. And since we're talking about task-based language teaching, and the theme of the conference this year is leveraging technology in task-based language teaching, I think I would like to perhaps initiate our conversation here by asking you both, in your view, based on your experience, Martha, more on the applied linguist side of things and Scott more on the teaching part of things, what makes a task authentic when it's mediated by technology? I think that's a question that I have for you.
Okay. So for me, a task is authentic when it's authentically mediated by technology. That means lots of the things that we used to do in books are not authentic anymore because in the real world, they're actually mediated by technology. So looking at a map is an example, right? Or the typical questions of how do you go from X to B. No one says that anymore. You take out your phone and look where you are, and you may ask, where is the best? And so in this case, the technology has actually modified the task because authentically, in the real world, that task requires certain technologies.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think one of the things that in classroom situations where you're trying to implement a kind of task-based or post-communicative approach through those kind of iconic activities like information gap activities and so on, there's a certain suspension of disbelief involved. You're getting, you've got the famous describe and draw with two students opposite each other, and they've got one got a picture and describes it to their mate, and they have to listen and draw and everything. Well, hang on, why don't you just show me the damn thing? One of the I think interesting things about technology or distance teaching or learning through technology is that distance, in fact, does create an element of authenticity in terms of that information gap. There is a need to communicate. You can't just show so easily what you're doing. And I think that's one of the things, as Martha says, of course, so many of our daily tasks are involved in this kind of connecting at a distance. And we don't have to look back very far to the pandemic to see how we were all at a distance. Everything was remote, and yet we managed because we had the technology to do that. We had to learn how to adapt some of our tried and true classroom procedures for that kind of context. But I find, again, with reference to Dogma, the book that Luke Medigans and I produced in 2009, which was a collection of practical ideas, classroom ideas for Dogma, we didn't mention technology. They fairly easily adaptable, we discovered, to an online context. And in fact, a student or participant in one of our online courses actually went through the book, someone who knew technology better than we did. And he annotated every single activity in the book to show how it would work or could work in an online context. So that was encouraging. Yeah, coming back to the question of authenticity, the other thing about online interaction is that it's essentially multimodal, which is difficult in the classroom, perhaps for many classrooms to implement. But the multimodality is its great potential, so that people can send images to each other, they can send voice messages to each other, they can text each other, etc., and they can do all three. And that would seem to add an element of authenticity that you can't so easily replicate in the classroom. I think one of the things about online interaction, that we've always known, is that we've got a choice between two modes, the synchronous and the asynchronous. In the classroom, you don't have the asynchronous kind of option, really. You can write each other notes. But both have huge advantages, it seems to me, in a task-based approach. So that synchronous communication can be mediated through voice or through text. And it's great because it's happening in real time. And that's something that we do in the real world. So there's a strong element of authenticity. Asynchronous interaction, I think, is also equally valid. In fact, different kinds of tasks and different kinds of purposes. So having time to think about what you write or what you say and not being rushed. So working like in a forum or discussion board or whatever, posting messages backwards and forwards. And I think research has shown that there's increments in terms of accuracy, definitely, and complexity of the message. It may not be authentic, but certainly in the classroom to try and set up a sort of gap between the communication. But it is authentic to a lot of what we do in the real and outside, and just sending emails, which has been around for a very long time. I'm actually a ex-student of mine who's now a teacher trainer at the University of Barcelona, or at the language school associated with the University of Barcelona, has been doing work with colleagues using WhatsApp for out-of-class communication and as an option for the students. So very simple, forming a WhatsApp group, teacher posts tasks, teacher models the task, maybe feeds in some useful language, and then the students outside of classroom hours, they communicate with each other in synchronously. And the results are very positive in terms of the degree of participation, the amount of participation. And what's really encouraging is that how this learners, once they build up a group, and this comes back to this thing of authenticity again. Most of these learners, this is in Spain, and they already belong to WhatsApp groups. They're very familiar with WhatsApp. I think there's something like a 91% take-up of WhatsApp in Spain, and probably pretty typical around the world. So it's not a big deal to form a WhatsApp. These are adults, of course, so there's no problems about permissions, etc. What is interesting is that, okay, they do the tasks. Each task has several stages, take about 2 or 3 days to work through a task. There'd be simple things like posting a picture from a holiday they've had, and the other students have to guess where it is and comment on and ask questions and that sort of thing, or putting up a photo which is distorted or very close up and it's not clear what it is, and of something that they own, and students have to guess. Other students have to guess. So they do these tasks. I know there's an element there of inauthenticity because it's not something we would normally do in a WhatsApp group, send obscure photos to friends and say, guess what that is? Maybe we might. But what's interesting is that once the group is formed, all the communication is English, apart from some translanguaging with vocabulary issues, etc. And they carry on. They talk to each other outside of the task. So there's on-task work and off-task work. And so this kind of developed over the course of the 1 month, this intensive course that they documented, or maybe 2 months, such that some of them carried on communicating with each other using the same group forum after the course was over, so at a purely social level. So that seems to me super authentic. And in a sense, that's where we want our students to be going. However we teach, whatever technology we're using, we want them to be able to transfer the classroom language, the taught language, as it were, into the real world, and to be able to use it with speakers of their own language, but use it by choice. So I think, again, can't get more authentic than that.
The word authentic is the word of the day, I think. And maybe based on that, not the definition of the word. This is what I'm thinking. The definition of the word authentic maybe hasn't changed, or maybe it has, but into which task it applies. Scott, you're referencing the first version of the book where you didn't mention technology at all. Martha gave the example perfectly, I think, of giving directions or pointing out to a map and indicating. I think we can agree in 2025 that's probably not very authentic. Very few people are doing that. It's just put it in your phone. Google Maps tells you where to go. Maybe we'll start with Marta. How has your definition of the word authentic changed with the technology that we have now?
I think for me, it is the most important thing is to always think that the technology has to be derived from the task. So the task is what brings a well-developed task is what brings learning. Now, the technology is there to help facilitate that task, to make it more authentic, to make it more motivational, to bring it to a generation that is digitally native somehow, or that have a short span of thought. So to me, the technology should always be supporting the task. But what needs to be authentic is the task, not so much the technology. So if a task is a well-developed task, authentic, relevant, communicative, with a need for those students, if it comes supported by technology, great. If it doesn't, there's no need for it. We don't have to put technology there. But definitely, if the technology is part of the task, then we should address that technology.
Beautiful.
I wanted to add one thing here, which probably will lead to the question that I wanted to ask. I was looking at the program, and you've mentioned this, Martha, in terms of what happens when students are engaged in an authentic task. And we know that technology-mediated language learning has long been part of TBLT. As Scott mentioned with WhatsApp, you've mentioned it with games in one of your talks, which I wanted to talk about. I think the question that I have then is, what makes the current moment feel different or more dynamic now with this new emerging, what we call generative AI? So what is it? What makes using technology now in this current moment, in this current stage of our lives in 2025 with artificial intelligence, what makes this moment feel more different, feel more dynamic for the use of technology with task-based language teaching?
Me or just Scott?
Both of
Martha,
you.
you start.
I start. I think what makes this moment today, maybe not tomorrow, but today, more fluid, dynamic, fast going, is that we are fully immersed in technology. Look at what we are doing right now, right? There's to take the train from Amsterdam here, you have to have the app on your phone. You will not let you like print a PDF into your phone. We're fully immersed in it. So all our lives have some are touched at some point by technology. So before you could live a life without technology. But as Scott was saying, comes the pandemic, everybody is forced to work with technology. The pandemic ends and some people become super reticent because I'm not going to see a computer in my life ever again. But regardless of that, everybody understood what you can do with technology. So I think what has happened after the pandemic and now with AI is that it has given us so many more affordances that so many more people are willing to take in teaching and education. So they're there, and many of them are free. And you don't know much about it. There's a million workshops that you can take. There's lots of educational videos. If you want to use technology, you can. That's what's different from maybe, I would say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think I'm not at all well versed in the pedagogical applications of AI. I've not used it in classrooms or in a teacher training context, although I'm familiar with pre-AI tools like machine translation and the possibilities for independent or autonomous use of the tools would seem to be massive once learners are trained into how to use them. So the idea, for example, of having a conversation partner online who's a bot, and we've gone beyond the Turing test now. I think it's very difficult, almost impossible to tell if you're talking to a machine or a bot. But again, for those who don't mind, again, this question of authenticity again, there's a certain suspension of disbelief when you're talking to a bot. You know that it's not a human, but nevertheless, for language learning and practice purposes, it's a great thing to do, whether you're talking with voice or talking texting. If I was starting off learning a new language, I had access to a bot that spoke that language, then I think that would be one way that I could get the kind of practice that I can't necessarily get full-time, even with a one-to-one teacher. It's a bit like all those things that we encourage learners to do, like extensive reading and watching streamed videos, etc., and watching them with or without subtitles and watching them twice and playing them more slowly and all the sorts of things you can do for autonomous learning, which is fantastic. Remember the days of Teach Yourself Swahili, the book, and all you had was that, which was a grammar and a few turgid exercises. Now, the sky's the limit in terms of what you can do as an autonomous learner. But the key word there is autonomy. Some learners don't have autonomy, or they need to be trained to be autonomous, or they don't want to be autonomous. They do like to trot along to a language school or to have a one-to-one teacher who's a real person, whether it's online or face-to-face. So I think there's obviously a danger there too. So if everybody picks up, also, oh, hang on, I don't need to go to a class anymore. I don't need to have a teacher because I can just do it through these apps and tools, etc., which give me all the information I need. So there's no limit. Although I have to say, a lot of the information you get about language from AI still, like a lot of information about anything, is hallucinogenic. You ask it to explain the third conditional to you, you get extraordinarily Lewis Carroll kind of invented explanation, or it's just been whole as follows copied off some bad grammar site somewhere online. But for that kind of interactivity in real time that you get through chatting or writing to a bot, then there's a lot there that the one-to-one teacher used to be able to do it maybe now disenfranchises in a sense. So I see there's dangers, of course, from a professional point of view. And there's dangers, like with any technology, that if it makes language learning cheaper, even if it's not necessarily as effective, then that's what the owners, the directors of language schools or whatever will opt towards, because if they can get rid, after all, the biggest single expense for language schools and academies is the teacher's salary roll. If we can move the teacher out and move the AI in, then that's a temptation that's going to be hard to resist, is being hard to resist, I'm sure, in a lot of contexts. So yes, there's pluses and there's minuses.
I don't know if you heard what Bill Gates said the other day, but Bill Gates predicted that within 10 years, AI will replace teachers completely.
Yeah, he's always been saying this. He said that before AI. He said that about microcomputers will replace teachers. He said that in 1963. And people have been saying it's well documented, the claims that have been made about technology. What's his name? That wonderful writer in Australia who's written, I'm seeing it now, Distrusting Educational Technology, Neil Selwyn, among many books. Neil Selwyn has documented the history of the hype associated with technologies, and particularly in relation to education and how they're going to get. And they've been saying this since television broadcasts to schools in the 1930s. So that's the end of classrooms. That's the end of schools or universities as we know. We'll just put everyone in front of a television screen and beam them lectures. That didn't last very long. So we have to be very skeptical of these claims. I have to say, I was skeptical when I first heard of whenever it was 2 or 3 years ago, when ChatGPT burst upon the scene, and I think and then I started playing with it, and I was amazed and freaked out. And then I started using it for my own purposes. So to do correspondence in Catalan, for example, where I live in Barcelona, and my Catalan's not very good, but it's just my written Catalan. And so to do kind of stuff where it really matters to get it right, rather than just churning something through a machine translator and just say, okay, here's the letter I received. I want you to respond to it and say, this is why I have to refuse this request. And it was fantastic. And I'd already written, this was in relation to something, I'd already written a letter in Spanish to this place saying, I can't do this. And they hadn't responded. So I got AI to do this beautifully formulated letter in Catalan to them, and they immediately responded, and they were all over me. And it was like, clearly they hadn't known or couldn't care that I'd used a machine to formulate this reply. So the implication of that in terms of teaching writing or teaching academic writing or teaching business skills in English is mind-blowing. And I still can't get my head around where it's going to take us. Students really need to learn to write anymore. Discuss.
I think the main roles of the teachers is going to be first creating communities of learning, because we know that those are essential for learning. So yes, if you're a motivated student and want to learn on your own, Duolingo has existed for the last 20 years. I still haven't met a person that speaks a language that has been trained just with Duolingo. And I use it myself, so I'm not going to say anything, but there's that sense of community that is so important for language learning. And so far, I'm just saying, so far, AI is not able to reproduce that yet. That's one thing. And the other thing to me is that the more AI we have, the more we need teachers to work with the students in their critical digital literacies. So it's great to have these tools. They're here. They're not going away. Most students will need those for their jobs, and they need to learn to use them. But they need to use them critically, and they need to use them ethically, and they need to use them knowing what it means when you're copying something that you haven't written, when you're citing things that you don't know where they come from, what kind of bias it comes with, and taking that something has given you and make it your own. So teachers need to still, I think teachers are going to be useful still to teach this type of appropriation your own voice, putting your own voice into writing. And so far, the only thing so far, AI can still not do that. So I don't think that you're not going to step around there with this car. It has been the typical sentence 10 years ago was technology is not going to replace teachers, but it will replace teachers that don't know how to use technology. Still hasn't happened. In my institution, there's a couple of dinosaurs that I still have to go on a big email for around. So no, they're still. So I don't think teachers are going anywhere anytime soon.
They said the same thing about the blackboard back in 1900. But I think what I'm interested in, Martha, because you have done quite a lot of work with technology and task-based language teaching, and you've mentioned that the role of the teacher is to look at technology from a more critical lens and help students utilize technology in a better way, in a way that allows them to do things outside the classroom. And in one of your talks, you're talking about games as collaborative tasks, and you talk about efficacy, engagement, and willingness to communicate. I think one of the questions that I have, and I think many people will probably be thinking about the exact same thing, is how, perhaps not what role, but how does technology shape or perhaps even influence the way learners engage with tasks?
Well, it totally changes the way that students engage. So students, you can have the same task done in three different technological contexts, and that task changes, right? Because there are the affordances of the technology that allow the task to go in one way or another. So many of these tasks are about communicating with others and doing something, right? But you can do that in a game, for example. You have the affordances of the game, you have the in-game characters, you have whatever comes up to you as forms of help, you have a point system, you have those are the affordances of that technology. You can do the same task in a video Zoom conference, right? The affordances are different. You still can do the internet, you can find words, you can do. So I think the task, the relation between the task and the technology, it is totally symbiotic. Task affects technology and technology affects task. And I don't think you can separate it, you know.
I'm always interested. I'm always interested in moving away from teaching and tasks at the moment. But when you read interviews with writers, novelists, etc., and they often ask during the course of the interview how they write. It's interesting those who say, "I do it all by hand initially, and then I either type it up or I hand it to my secretary or whatever." And then those who have long since abandoned handwriting, and both groups have very good reasons for doing it. But it does seem to be clear that whether you use the tech or what technology you use alters, just as Martha was saying, it alters your perception of the task, your engagement with the task, your comfort with the task. And I guess it comes back to me, it's all about learners' choice. I always go back to Michael Breen whenever I want to brush up on the philosophy of task-based teaching. But this is from a paper he wrote called Learner Contributions to Task Design. It was republished in Van der Branden et al., Task-Based Language Teaching, a reader, John Benjamins. And he said, learners will invest effort in any task if they perceive benefit from it. Therefore, require learners to seek out and choose content which they perceive as appropriate to their learning needs and interests. And I would add then, not just the content, but the means, the technology that they feel is appropriate. So they want to do it, they want to do a presentation, they want to do it in front of the class, and they want to do it orally. That's their choice. If they want to do it as recorded, as a podcast or whatever, that's their choice. But they'll be more invested if they have been given this choice. And of course, if they've considered the choices and discussed them, etc., what the options are. And I think, and coming back to content, I suppose the sort of fundamental premise underlining the whole dogma thing was that you make the student content, the content of the curriculum. That is to say, the student generated content or the student provided or the student sourced content. It needn't be original content that students say or write, but that they find on the internet or whatever, and then they bring to the classroom and they present to the class and they re-signify in terms of their own interests and concerns, etc. And that's really what Dogma is all about, is like not using the course book, not because course books are inherently evil. I mean, they are, but because student content, student-generated content is more interesting. I'm sorry, but it just has to be. And B, because of that, it's more motivating both to produce and to interpret or listen to or read, but also it's better preparation for the real world, again, coming back to this thing, talking about authenticity and autonomy, etc. So student-generated content is the bridge between the classroom and the real world. And it's the bridge back from the real world into the classroom. So what they can bring from outside, from their job, from their studies, etc., into the classroom. So giving them the means and the incentive to provide their own material, and as I said before, to provide them, or to choose the technology with which to process that material, that's going to change the nature of the task. And say, rather than doing something rather artificial, taken out of the course book or whatever, more than anything, maybe not the technology necessarily, but it's the learner's investment in that technology, and it's learner's investment in the content. I'm thinking of I always quote this project that was done ages ago in Thailand by David Hall and a group of colleagues, Australians. It's quoted in this series of books, Innovation in English Language Teaching. It's a study done in 2001. They called it the Talk-Based Project, and it was for academic writing and presentation skills for young adults, university students in Thailand. And we're talking now pre-internet, although the paper was republished in 2001. I don't think this research study was done in the 1980s. So the technology we're talking about here is basically libraries and books. But the students on the first day of the course, they're just given a slip of paper, each student with a different subject on it. And it's related in some way to their study. So imagine that they're all, I don't know, agronomists or ecologists or whatever, they might be given something on, say, water. I mean, something like that, or erosion, or etc. And they go away and they come and prepare a short 5-minute presentation about that. They're using whatever resources they can find and what they know. They come back and they do that in groups. They do it to each other. They get feedback from their colleagues. And then they go using that feedback. So it's a kind of cyclical thing of researching, rehearsing, feedback, and then eventually publication or performance, whether it's written or spoken. It moves into the written mode. And the whole course, as they describe it, was based around this process where the students generated the content. And according to the researchers, it was extremely effective, it was extremely communicative, it was extremely engaging, it ticked all the boxes. Now, the question is, to me, how could you replicate that nowadays? Because if you say to students, go away and find out something about erosion and come back and be prepared to talk about it, they'll just Google erosion. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's really what we want to do. Is that downloaded text? Maybe it's a text in their first language and they have it instantly translated into English and they read it aloud to the rest of the class. That is like dead boring. But I think, nevertheless, the principle is a good one of learners accessing their own content and then doing this. It's a task-based cycle of rehearsal, feedback, and then repeating the task, adjusting, etc. Task repetition. We know how marvelous that is. It's possible. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible, and it's very more possible than ever. But one would have to design the sequence, and so that the students didn't take the kind of easy route, which didn't involve the kind of processing, language processing. This is what task-based approach is all about, really, is to reach the parts of language processing that more superficial methods don't reach. But anyway, I just throw that out because it's if I was teaching academic writing nowadays, I think I would try to replicate that sort of cycle where it's basically collaborative. But again, coming back to this, my initial point is the learners choose the content, and then of course the learners could also choose the technology which mediates the content.
I can give you an example of an AI, which is what you were describing, Scott. My university created, the journalism department, my university created these AI called journalism dogs. And students input their ideas, write a journalistic article about something. And then they have different dogs that they can apply to either improve their storytelling, to improve their sources, to improve where they could have media support. And there's different dogs that they can apply, and it's all AI generated. That's amazing, really good tool. Because the students, the content is still the students' content. The students have to write their paper in there. They have to put it right there, put it there. And then they're using the AI tool individualized for each student to improve what they need in writing. So that's something that we can do in a classroom. If you have a classroom of 50 students in a journalism classroom, yeah, the teacher can read all of those papers and can give you comments, but not to the level, not to the individualized feedback that the machine can. So I think there are tools that really, that we can take advantage of. So as teachers, I think our job is to think how to best harness those technologies, because we know how students learn, right? Machines don't know that, but we know that. So what kind of technologies, what kind of, and maybe like in this case, you have to actually develop it, right? But what kind of technology can I apply that would enhance what my students, or how my students can learn? Because I know what it is that they need. So an example that, as Leo was asking about this game that we presented this morning, it's actually my PhD students' data dissertation, but we used the game, and what we varied was the task. The game existed to be played individually, but as teachers or as applied linguists, we know that most of the learning is in the negotiation of a thing, right? It's in the input, it's in the interaction. So we said, okay, the interaction with the game already exists, but what if we unpause that by putting students together to play in pairs, right? And then what we found out is actually the students that play the game individually, how it is supposed to play the game fitted. But those that play individually, not only they really liked it, they really enjoyed it, and they were much more willing to talk, to communicate and use the game than the other ones. So we are the ones that need to take the technology to do what we want it to do for us.
It's funny, you in a way answered part of one of the questions that I had. And I was trying to see if I could remember who said it, but I think it was Savignon in '76, and I think he was very correct when she says that attitude is, I think she said attitude is the single most important factor in second language learning. And in your work, Martha, with technology, you mentioned a little bit, but how have students in general responded to using technology for language learning? What have you observed in terms of motivation, in terms of autonomy, in terms of interaction, engagement, and things like that?
I think motivation is difficult now. It used to be motivating to use technology 10 years ago, but now it's whatever. That's beautiful. It's not it's not an intrinsic motivation just because it's technology. Is what you do with it, right? That may be a little bit different and motivating to them. I am actually starting to investigate things like self-efficacy and to communicate, because I realized that students are such big worlds, and in applied linguistics, we tend to take the cognitive route. That's where I come from, right? More of a cognitive route. But then more and more, I think after the pandemic, even more, I realized that some students they're fragile. They need much more motivation, or they need to find their own voices, their own self-efficacy, their own willingness to learn and invest in their own learning. So I think all of these psycho-emotional concepts have been a little bit abandoned. Although you had Sarah Merced in your podcast, and she's like one of the main researchers on emotions in applied linguistics. I think they're very important. And when it comes to technology, even more, somehow students are willing to do things in the classroom, but maybe not so much with technology. And the example for me is gaming, right? I have semesters where I say, okay, we're going to game. And I got some of like half of the class going, okay, you know, who wants to game, right? I think people have strong feelings towards some technologies, and we have to take them into account when we develop tasks with those technologies, because that's going to affect how much they learn, how much anxiety is going into it, and how much willingness to really engage on the task comes with it. So I think we have to be a little bit careful to not just think on just like cognitive part of it, but also the affection part of it.
Fascinating. Really interesting. I'm curious, Scott, you and Luke published Teaching Unplugged in 2009. And you mentioned that you didn't include, or I forget if you said you didn't consider technology. If you and Luke, and I know you have the new book out now that's more teacher contributions, but in alternate universe, if you and Luke were tasked with writing the original Teaching Unplugged again today, would you approach it any differently? As to what Marta is saying, there is a danger of going too far with technology, right? So how do you think you and Luke would balance that if you were tasked with rewriting it now?
It's been an issue that's almost since the inception of dogma has been debated. And it's simplistic to say that just because I would say, are not anti-textbooks, but because we don't see an important role for textbooks in the classroom, we didn't, therefore it follows that we also wouldn't see an important role for technology. I don't think the two things are necessarily related. One is a medium, one is the content. Although we certainly would agree that I remember the days when I was teaching in a language school in Barcelona, and the only technology was really video, and we only had 2 or 3 videos per floor, and you'd wheel these damn things down the floor. You could never get the things to work, all the different cables and things, and somebody had pinched the batteries from the remote control. And all the flapping around that was involved, and just getting up and then showing, you say to teacher, what do you use the videos for? And they say, oh, we show them Mr. Bean, a series of Mr. Bean, and they have a good laugh. I said, you must just use the course book. Serious? That same attitude can translate, that's the kind of degenerate form of using technology-mediated content in classrooms. You just bring stuff in and you plump the students in front of us, whether it's a TED talk, whether it's a podcast for that matter, and just say, watch that. So it's all about, again, it's all about learner's choice, but it's all about also what you actually do. I'm still with the technology. I'm still in 2 minds about overloading classrooms with technology, which, as Martha says, it may once have been motivating, things like interactive whiteboards and things that, oh, this is really modern and flash. But kids nowadays, it's also normalized that it's just not a big deal. I'm nervous about, and I always was nervous about bringing mobile phones into the classroom, not because of any technological issues, but because they're so distracting. And research would seem to bear that out. And if there's a phone in the classroom, even if it's turned off, it sucks attention away from everything else. And so it seems to me that classrooms are very special spaces. We discovered that during COVID, how special they are and how we missed them. They're very special places, not so much for learning, but for using language and for socializing, for the social aspects of language learning, which is incredibly important, motivating, group formation, community practice and all that kind of stuff. Outside the classroom, and I'm returning to the point I made earlier, there seems to be enormous potential now for using technology for self-directed learning and for flipping the classroom and all blending it and all these different kind of permutations of using. But my gut feeling is I want to keep the classroom space relatively minimalist so as to be able to create an ecology which is human-centered and not technology-centered. So that's where, long way around to answer your question, Andrew, but I mean, in terms of if we were to rewrite the book, which in a sense has been done now with this new book, we would certainly include activities which exploited technology can do the kinds of things that the basic principles behind dogma generate language, learner-generated language, which could be then for the focus of some kind of focus on form or whatever you want to call it. If technology helps generate the language, if it helps learners focus on the form, fine. But if it doesn't do that, if it's a distraction, or if it occupies the space at the expense of real social communication between human beings, then don't bring it in.
Nice.
I think this conversation is going in a direction that I really, because I think it goes back to what you said, Andrew, with Steve Jobs. No, Bill Gates, right? It was Bill Gates' quote. Yeah.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. Their predictions are often wrong. So I don't really rely on them for
Same thing
being
about
my
Doc.
no,
No more
but being
Doc.
not, yeah, being our Nostradamus, I don't think they work well. That's not a role they should have. But I think I have a question that one of the teachers that I interacted with recently on a social media platform had asked me, and maybe this is a question for Martha because maybe she has more experience with that. We've been talking a lot about the benefits of using technology in task-based teaching. I think the question that I have for you then, Martha, is what are some of the, and it's a question we asked in our self-reflection here in the session, is what do you consider to be some of the challenges or perhaps some of the limitations that you have encountered when leveraging technology in TBLT?
I think I work with teachers that may be in rural areas or places in the world where technology is not like we expect in most other places. So I think you can develop like these really cool tasks that have technology attached to it. But as a teacher, your task or your technology mediated tasks should be able to be done by every single student that you have. So the most technological thing that you do in class should be what your weakest link can do. So in some places in the world, it's really difficult to do things with the internet because internet is unstable, or they cannot get it at home. They can only get it at their university, or they have to go to kiosk to get internet. So I think once the technology that you bring is a burden to the task, you should rethink the whole thing. The challenge is to be able to manage people in the class that may have their own laptop, their iPhone, and really good stable connection with others that share one computer, three siblings in one room, and the connection comes and goes. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for teachers. Be realistic in what you can do with technology. Technology should not be a burden. It should enhance your tasks. So some of the teachers I train, like get really excited, and they're gonna do this, and they're gonna do that, and then they get assigned to a little village which has internet between 2 and 3. And they're like, oh, come on, man. Then you need to rethink what you're doing. Maybe you need to use cell phones, and maybe you need to do things. So I think that's why I am a firm believer on the needs analysis before you do anything that has to do with technology-based ELT. You need to know not just what target task and what language is involved in those target tasks, but you need to know what the capacities of your participants, students and teachers. You need to know what their digital literacies are, what they know to do, what they don't know what to do, what kind of support you have in your institution, what kind of support your students have to be able to accomplish the tasks. And if all of those don't align perfectly, don't do it. Just do tasks.
Right.
So tasks are good, so just do tasks.
I think we're coming to the end here of our conversation, and right before we jump into the last question, I just wanted to once again thank the Task-Based Language Teaching Conference organization for making this possible thanks to technology. And we thought about even not doing the presentation anymore, but Andrew and I convinced ourselves that since there was a conference on technology and task-based language teaching, we said, why don't we just try to pitch them the idea of having us doing this virtually? So I wanted to thank the organization. I wanted to thank Audrey also for making this happen. She's been great and a wonderful supporter and a good friend of ours now as well, and Scott and Martha. And before we wrap up, folks, I think I have it's more of a general question, but I think I'm like looking forward, looking ahead. And the question I have is, what excites you most about the future of task-based language teaching and technology?
What it excites me more is that I don't know what's coming next. So I am always excited about applying the principles that I know about task-based language teaching to whatever comes my way and be able to say, it works. I can do this. I can still do TBLT. I could do it in, I don't know, ACMC. I can do it in AI, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. And be able to the principles really apply and can be used.
Yeah, I guess I've always felt this was something that technology and language could achieve, but it seldom is in the kind of pedagogical tasks that traditionally we set anyway. And that is, what can learners do collaboratively using technology, which has a real positive impact in the real world? I'm thinking of projects which, for example, students collaboratively designing and publicizing a crowdsourcing project for Global South water access or something like that, or designing a curriculum that would help integrate immigrant children with no families into the culture, the target culture of a place like Spain, for example, doing something that they could then possibly take out into the real world and actually apply. And I think that would be hugely motivating. And we worry about tasks not having outcomes, but if there was an outcome that had some visible positive effect, then that would be a wonderful combination, bringing everything together: the technology, the language, the task, the pedagogy, and breaking the walls between the classroom and the real world. But that's my dream.
I think that's a wrap for us here. Any more comments, Andrew? Any questions you would like to ask, or should we?
I think that's a good way to end it. Just to echo what you said, thank you to everyone for inviting us, for participating. Scott, thank you for coming. Marta, thank you as well for volunteering to be part of this. It's been wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
For inviting us.